In this episode of Truth or Scare, we're unpacking the good, the bad, and the ugly of tariffs, and whether or not the word tariffs really is the most beautiful word in the world.
The word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. More beautiful than love, more beautiful than respect.
Or if it is something that is seriously dangerous. And I'm going to tell you right now, some of the answers may surprise you. And not only that, the repercussions for you as a consumer could be significantly worse than what you think. Because contrary to popular belief, a tariff isn't just a tax on an importing country, it's a tax on everyone. But before we get into it, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want the truth about finances, the ugly truth in some cases, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Let's talk about tariffs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because yes, there are cases where tariffs can be used strategically to benefit an economy, but often their use is not as simple as just putting a tax on the foreign importer and making a whole bunch more money as a government and protecting jobs at home. In fact, it can have completely the opposite effect if countries aren't careful about how they utilize them. So today we're going to talk about what tariffs are, the hidden costs to consumers, the way that they can be utilized as a weapon in negotiations, and the harsh, ugly truths about what they really do to an economy. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about who is there to protect countries when it comes to trade wars, and the significant issues that have been created both by China and the United States in making sure that the organization designed to protect nations doesn't actually have the teeth that it needs in order to accomplish that mission. Okay, so let's start first by talking about what are tariffs. Tariffs are quite simply a tax on another country that imports goods into yours. And oftentimes governments justify tariffs as a means of increasing revenues, protecting industries, or to exert geopolitical leverage. So in other words, when there is an imbalance of power, using it as a tool to balance that power out or take advantage of your smaller competitors. And while this concept of tariffs is seemingly simple, the reality is it's not. It's not simply a tax on another country that imports goods into yours. And it's definitely not as simple as the other country pays the tariffs and everything is fine for the country that is imposing the tariffs. No, tariffs come with their own set of unique and complex issues that are both felt at home and abroad. And these tariffs have significant consequences, regardless if you are the country that is imposing them or the country that they are being imposed upon. And there's some key points to note when it comes to tariffs. First is that often the cost of the tariffs increase the prices of consumer goods, and not just by the simple dollar amount of the tariffs themselves, but quite often exponentially. And I'll show you a bit about that in a second. But these tariffs affect most often the lowest income people, because a 10% tariff on something like a toothbrush doesn't really affect somebody like Elon Musk as much as it does somebody who works every day a 9-to-5 job at minimum wage. So just like reducing taxes for the wealthy makes the wealthy richer and the poor poorer, tariffs have a tendency to do exactly the same. Now, with respect to their uses, they're often used as a key negotiating tool for governments. And sometimes it's just the threat of a tariff, and sometimes it's the actual implementing of a tariff. But the use of tariffs comes with consequences, because no country is going to accept a financial penalty that is designed to hurt their industries at home without taking retaliatory action. And this often leads to trade wars that often make both countries significantly worse off and have global repercussions beyond just the countries that are involved. And even though tariffs may seem like they're protective in nature, protecting the economy and jobs at home, it also leads to a very slippery slope that can harm global relations and subsequently economic stability. Because tariffs are very much a zero-sum game. There is almost always a winner and a loser, but more often than not, both countries end up losing. So let me illustrate this for you. So let's assume two countries are trade partners, and they have two options. They can either choose to use tariffs or choose not to. And in most cases, when two countries choose not to use tariffs, we have free trade. The two countries may have various resources, Some may be rich in one type of resource, the other in another type of resources, and trade between the two countries leads to a net benefit to both. If China, for example, has significantly higher capacity when it comes to producing electronics, and the US has higher capacity when it comes to agriculture, the two countries can trade technology for agriculture, and both countries win. And these are the basic fundamentals of free trade. This is why free trade agreements exist, and ultimately free trade is all about letting the markets do their work in order to create a balanced economy and to have production happen where it makes the most sense for certain types of goods while reducing the cost of certain types of goods for pretty much everybody. But let's say all of a sudden things change. Maybe one country does something to give one of its industries a leg up over its foreign competitors, essentially creating a playing field that is no longer fair. Well, an opposing country may decide to impose a tariff. And in this case, if country number one were to put a tariff into place, while country number two has no tariffs in place, essentially country number one becomes the winner and country number two potentially becomes the loser. This ends up creating a win-lose scenario. Now, in the same way that individuals don't like to be the loser in a transaction, neither do countries. So very rarely is there a scenario where there is a win-lose situation where there isn't a retaliation. And quite often, it's not even a retaliation on the industry that was originally involved. It becomes a retaliation on an industry that is an exporter to country number two. So country number two decides they're going to put tariffs in place and try to do the same type of harm to country number one they've done to one of their industries. And as a result, we end up in a scenario where we now have two countries that both have tariffs. And this leads to a lose-lose situation. So to put this in perspective, let's say the US was to introduce a tariff on goods from China. This is going to have an immediate effect on China's economy because their goods are becoming more expensive, and as the prices of the goods that are being exported start to go up, the demand for those goods also goes down, which has a direct impact on China's economy, making it smaller. But obviously, a country like China isn't going to let the US bully it. So China, in turn, is probably going to turn around and retaliate with a tariff of their own. And this is going to make the US economy smaller as well, as the industries impacted by China's tariffs start to suffer. Now, at the same time, we're seeing costs of goods go up in both countries. While the governments are collecting the tariffs and putting it into their coffers, the real costs are being passed on to the consumer. And therefore, the consumer has less money to spend on other goods, which causes a further contraction in both economies. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the absence of fair trade causes both economies in both countries to shrink. Now, in an ideal world, at some point, the two countries realize that the trade war is having significant effects on both their economies, and they start to negotiate and come to a freer trade agreement, which causes both economies eventually to have access to cheaper goods. Their exports are less expensive for the other country, and both countries benefit as a result. And in an ideal world, you'd see both countries find themselves in a free trade agreement where there was no tariffs whatsoever, and that would ultimately lead to a win-win situation as the economies of scale from having imports and exports that travel freely benefits both economies as well as the consumers that are ultimately paying the price for the goods that are moving back and forth. And while this is a very simple explanation of how tariffs work, it's really the only explanation that somebody needs. These are a very complex economic tool, and the reality is they can do a lot of damage if they aren't well understood. Because tariffs come with hidden costs, and they come with significant hidden costs. It's not just about collecting taxes from another nation. It's about the fact that the goods that the other nation exports are going to become more expensive. And that ultimately leads to a significant impact on consumers because the importers don't actually pay the taxes themselves. They pass the cost of the tariffs on to the consumer. And this ultimately raises retail prices, but not by the amount that the importer has had to increase its prices, by significantly more than that. And I'll show you that in just a second. But more importantly, low-income houses feel the most effects of these tariffs. The burden is without question on the consumer, and it hurts low-income families more than it hurts high-income families. And not only that, there's virtually nothing the government can do to fix this, because the revenues that are received from tariffs pale in comparison to the total additional costs that consumers end up paying for goods. Because what ends up happening is that when you give companies the ability to increase prices as a result of their costs going up, well, they always take it as an opportunity to make more money. And as a result, everyday goods like electronics and clothing become not just a little bit more expensive, but significantly more expensive. And to illustrate that, I want to show you the impact on prices. So let's look at something like, an iPhone, which for Apple may have a cost to produce of around $250. Apple, of course, knows that it needs a certain amount of margin in order for it to be profitable. Let's assume that that's 50%. So it would turn around and sell that phone to a retailer for about $500. And of course, the retailer knows that it needs a certain amount of margin in order to be profitable. So it turns around and sells the iPhone to the consumer for $1,000. And everybody all across the board makes money. So let's assume that the US was to impose a tax of 20% on that product. Now you might think, oh, that's only $50. So you might think that the cost of that tariff is only $50 to the consumer. But the actual impact is significantly greater than that. Because while the price for Apple to get that product into the country may have gone from $250 to $300, they're still going to operate within their margins, meaning that they aren't just going to increase the price of the iPhone by $50. No, they're going to increase it by $100, selling it to retailers for $600 instead of $500. So the impact of the tariff has actually allowed Apple to pocket more money as a result. Now, when it sells that product to the retailer who turns around and sells it to the consumer, the retailer is also going to increase their prices so that they can get their margins to where they want them to be. They're going to sell it to the consumer for $1,200. So while a tariff may be sold to the consumer as a $25 or a $50 charge on a good, and therefore that's about how much prices are going to go up, the reality is they go up significantly more than that. A $50 tariff on an iPhone could turn into a $200 price increase for the consumer. And it goes without saying that this is not only inflationary, but it lowers the effective income of consumers in the country that imposed the tariff in the first place. And this is why there's so much harm to a consumer when tariffs are imposed. But consumers aren't the only ones that face that significant impact. Domestic businesses also face it as well, because industries that use imported goods or imported materials to produce their products end up having higher production costs, which again get passed along to the consumer. And not only that, industries that have nothing to do with the original tariffs can find themselves being targeted by the other countries. Because while it may not make sense for China to impose a tariff on American technology, they may target another industry like agriculture in order to retaliate against the US in a dollar-for-dollar scenario. So while the US may have set out to attack the technology industry, the farmers back at home may end up finding themselves in the middle of a dispute that they had nothing to do with to begin with. And this is exactly what happened in 2018 when the US imposed tariffs on China. China turned around and retaliated, and it had significant impacts on the agriculture industry. Then on top of that, there's global impacts. Retaliatory tariffs reduce the export opportunities for local producers, and these trade wars end up leading to mistrust and slow global economic growth as a whole. And we're not just talking small numbers here, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. In 2018, $121 billion worth of goods were affected by the tariffs that were imposed by the US and the subsequent retaliatory tariffs that were imposed by China. And then it went way beyond that as China attempted to devalue their currency, which would have made their goods significantly cheaper and put the US at a further disadvantage. And this is when the US came back to the negotiating table and decided that maybe the trade war wasn't a good idea to begin with. And that leads us to the next piece of this conversation. How can tariffs be used as a negotiating weapon, and what are the dangers when it comes to doing just that? So let's talk about how a country can use tariffs as leverage. Obviously, right now, there is the significant threat of tariffs, which is leading countries to come to the negotiating table with the US in hopes of negotiating new deals that will perhaps make the impact less significant. And while using these tariffs as a negotiating tool may seem like a good idea to bring other countries to the negotiating table, a win-lose or a lose-lose negotiation breeds a lot of distrust. and it can have significant impact on future negotiations. Because just like people, countries don't forget when another country bullied them. And this damages those diplomatic relationships, the relationships that are so important when it comes to free trade and when it comes to having countries that are in a win-win partnership that leads to a better outcome for everyone. Not only that, if agreements can't be made where everybody wins, the mere threat of a tariff can do significant harm to domestic industries that rely on exporting. And the real fear is that the threats of the tariffs end up becoming real trade wars that have significant impacts over long periods of time. And you need to look no further than the US-China trade war that happened in 2018, where the US imposed tariffs to address trade imbalances and intellectual property theft. This, of course, resulted in increased consumer costs and retaliatory tariffs on agriculture that strained economic ties with one of the US's largest trading partners. And as much as China seems like it is an adversary, it is also a significant partner to the US. And when relationships between trading partners become torn, the repercussions can be absolutely brutal. In fact, leading up to the Great Depression, when the US implemented tariffs, hoping that it would make things better at home, it only made the situation worse. And many economists believe that the Great Depression was compounded by the tariffs that were designed to help the US pull out of it, but instead made things significantly worse, not just for the US, but for its global trading partners. The Great Depression was literally the prime example of what happens in a very bad lose-lose trading war. But there are times when tariffs are appropriate. And there's two cases for this. The first is when you are protecting emerging industries. Just look at industries like the solar industry and the electric car industry right now, where China and the US are competing to be the leaders in those industries. And giving the domestic producers of those products the opportunity to get a foothold is typically understood to be a good use of a tariff. And this has happened before. We've seen the US use this in the past to help develop the steel and the textile industries. But it's important that these tariffs are used temporarily, for a short period of time, in order to create fairness in the market. Extended tariffs or tariffs for no good reason are by their very nature dangerous. And the second time where tariffs make sense is when you're addressing unfair practices. Things like the dumping of goods into foreign markets because there's an oversupply domestically in a country, or when industries are being subsidized in order to allow them to compete globally. We've seen this between Boeing and Airbus, where the French government subsidized Airbus and subsequently tariffs had to be put in place to level the playing field. And when used strategically, a country can impose a tariff that impacts an industry in another country that's being subsidized to the extent that the other country pulls back the subsidies in order to make things fair. They can genuinely be used as a tool in order to create a level playing field, both domestically and abroad. They also make sense in the case of national security concerns. Protecting critical industries like defense, healthcare, and technology is a very valid use for tariffs. In fact, using them to protect industries where if the exporter decided to stop producing the product or exporting it to a country in general is a very good use. But it's important to note that this is different than blanket tariffs, where you're just imposing taxes on another country for the sake of imposing taxes. Other countries will, in general, understand if a country is protecting their national security. But when a country is simply imposing tariffs to create an unlevel playing field or to bully another country, that is going to be met almost 100% of the time with retaliatory measures. And this is exactly when tariffs become dangerous, because tariffs that aren't imposed strategically lead to trade wars. We already talked about what happened prior to the Great Depression with the Smoot-Hawley Act and the US-China trade war of 2018. But the real danger is the impact that tariffs have on consumers, exporters, and the global mistrust that is caused by their use. And not only that, these tariffs that are designed to protect local domestic industries, they also have another negative side effect, and that is by reducing their competitiveness. Industries that are protected by tariffs tend to become less innovative. They don't have to rely on making companies more efficient because they simply have the ability to produce without the worries of having foreign competition. And as a result, what often happens is these companies, instead of becoming more efficient and becoming more innovative, end up just having higher prices on pretty much everything. So even though there isn't a tariff being imposed on the domestic good that's being sold to domestic consumers, essentially tariffs that protect those industries act in the exact same way that a tariff would if it was being imposed on the domestic producer itself, essentially leading to higher costs, inflation, and all the bad things that we've already discussed come along with tariffs. And last but not least, these tariffs act as regressive taxes, hitting low-income households the hardest. And as a result of higher prices, both on domestic goods and foreign goods, consumer spending slows, and so too does the economy. And the bottom line is this: tariffs do nothing else than reduce access to affordable goods. That's it. That's all they do. But here's the ugly truth about tariffs, because it's way worse than all of that. Tariffs are often sold by politicians to voters as a means of protecting domestic production, insisting that the tariffs will lead to manufacturing coming home and subsequently there being more jobs available and lower prices on pretty much everything. But here's the reality: onshoring virtually never happens, because a company like Apple, just because China is hit with tariffs, isn't going to necessarily bring their production back to the USA. No, there's already a lack of labor available in the United States. And not only that, the labor here is significantly more expensive. So instead of moving production back to the US, companies will usually look for other alternatives in other countries that don't have the same tariffs imposed upon them. So a company like Apple may decide to stop producing its products in China because it's become too expensive, but they might move production to a place like Mexico instead, where there is more abundant labor and the labor costs are significantly cheaper. So the promise of bringing jobs back to America is simply a false one. Businesses will always look for the lowest cost place to produce goods, the most efficient places to produce goods, and I can tell you right now that that is almost never going to be domestically. And here's the bottom line: tariffs should only be used in specific scenarios. They should be used strategically, and the threat of tariffs can be just as dangerous as the tariffs themselves. The misuse of tariffs will almost always lead to economic inefficiencies and strained relationships, which is why it's so important for every country to put long-term stability ahead of short-term political gain. Oh, and at the beginning of this video, I promised that I would tell you the really crazy thing about who is there to enforce the rules when it comes to world trade and what's happened as a result. Because the World Trade Organization is the organization that is tasked with making sure that countries don't unfairly impose tariffs on other countries. They're designed because of previous global agreements with respect to trade that acknowledged that free trade was the best thing for the global economy. And guess what? The two biggest countries when it comes to trade, both for imports and exports, China and the US, for the last decade, have blocked the World Trade Organization's ability to actually enforce the rules. Which, by the way, is why we're seeing things like the BRICS nations form an alliance to reduce the reliance on the US dollar and US trade in order to have more freedom and less bullying from the world's global economic superpower, which ultimately is not a good thing for the US and could eventually lead to the US's status as a superpower collapsing. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see what always happens before a superpower falls, make sure you check out this video right here.